The reality unfolding in Texas right now tells us something fundamental about power, about economic interests, and about the fractures appearing in what many assumed was a unified political base. When we see significant resistance emerging not from the usual opposition but from within the very heartland that helped propel someone to power, we need to pause and ask ourselves, what economic forces, what material conditions are actually driving this moment? Texas represents more than geography. It's a nexus of energy interests, border economics, immigration labor markets, and increasingly, technology capital. When policies collide with the actual economic machinery that keeps a region functioning, when ideology meets the hard reality of profit margins and production chains, something has to give. What we're witnessing isn't just political theater or partisan disagreement. This is about competing factions of capital, about business interests that relied on certain labor flows and trade relationships now facing disruption, about local power structures pushing back against federal overreach that threatens their bottom line. The establishment media will frame this as personalities and polling numbers, but if we look beneath the surface, we see a classic conflict between different sectors of the economy, each with their own material interests and their own vision of how power should operate. Let me start by saying something that might sound counterintuitive to those who've been following the headlines with a kind of surface-level attention. What's happening in Texas right now isn't really about one individual's panic or about some sudden awakening of conscience among Republican voters. No, what we're seeing is something much more structural, much more rooted in the actual functioning of capitalism and the way different fractions of the capitalist class negotiate their interests when those interests begin to diverge. And they are diverging right now in profound ways. You see, Texas has always been this fascinating laboratory for understanding American capitalism in its purest form. It's a state that has historically prided itself on minimal regulation, on being friendly to business, on keeping taxes low and labor cheap. The entire Texas economic miracle, as it's been called, rests on a very specific set of arrangements. You have the old oil and gas interests, the traditional energy sector that built Houston and Midland and made families extraordinarily wealthy. But alongside that, over the past 2 decades, you've had this massive influx of technology companies, of manufacturing plants, of logistics hubs. Austin has become a secondary Silicon Valley. Tesla builds cars there. Samsung is building semiconductor plants. The economic base has diversified in ways that create competing interests, competing visions of what policies actually serve capital accumulation. Now here's where it gets interesting. When we talk about immigration policy, when we talk about mass deportations, when we talk about aggressive enforcement that disrupts labor markets, we're not talking about abstract principles. We're talking about the actual mechanics of how businesses operate, how they source their labor, how they keep their costs down, how they maintain their profit margins. The construction industry in Texas is heavily dependent on immigrant labor. The agricultural sector, what remains of it at scale, absolutely requires seasonal workers who will do backbreaking work for wages that most native-born workers simply won't accept, not because of laziness or entitlement, but because those wages don't meet the cost of living for someone who's been raised with American expectations of what constitutes a livable income. The restaurant industry, the hospitality sector, the entire infrastructure of service work that keeps cities like Houston and Dallas and San Antonio functioning, all of this rests on a labor force that includes millions of people who came here seeking better opportunities, who've built lives, who've had children who are American citizens, who've integrated themselves into the economic fabric of the state. When you threaten that with mass deportation, when you create an atmosphere of fear and instability, you're not just affecting those workers. You're affecting every business that depends on them, every supply chain that relies on their labor, every sector of the economy that has structured itself around their availability and their willingness to work. And so what we're seeing now is something predictable if you understand how capitalism actually functions. The business community in Texas, or at least significant portions of it, is pushing back. Not because they've suddenly become humanitarian or progressive or compassionate, but because their material interests are being threatened. This is not a moral awakening. This is economic calculation. When the Chamber of Commerce starts expressing concern, when construction company executives start speaking up, when agricultural associations begin lobbying, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because they see their labor supply being disrupted. They see their costs going up. They see their ability to function being compromised. But it goes deeper than just immigration. Let's talk about trade policy. Texas has a longer border with Mexico than any other state. The economic integration between Texas and Mexico is profound. Billions of dollars in goods cross that border every day. Manufacturing supply chains are deeply interconnected. A part might be made in Texas, sent to Mexico for assembly, then come back to Texas for final finishing. This is how modern capitalism works. It's about cross-border production networks, about exploiting wage differentials while maintaining logistical efficiency, about arbitraging different regulatory environments and labor costs to maximize profitability. When you start talking about tariffs, about disrupting these flows, about making trade more difficult and more expensive, you're attacking the very structure that Texas businesses have spent decades building. The Port of Houston is one of the busiest in the country. The trucking and logistics infrastructure in Texas is enormous. All of this depends on relatively smooth trade relationships, on predictable policies, on the ability to plan long-term investments without sudden disruptions. Business hates uncertainty more than almost anything else. Capital needs stability to function efficiently, to calculate returns, to make investment decisions that might take years to pay off. And then there's energy. Now, Texas is still very much an oil and gas state, and you might think that the energy sector there would be uniformly supportive of policies that favor fossil fuels. But even within that sector, there are splits. You have companies that have invested billions in renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, because Texas actually has excellent conditions for both. West Texas has some of the best wind resources in the country. The state generates more wind power than any other. There are massive solar installations being built. These aren't hippie environmental projects. These are profit-seeking capitalist enterprises that have calculated that renewable energy is cost-effective, that it can generate returns, that it represents the future, even if the fossil fuel industry tries to delay that future as long as possible. When federal policy starts favoring fossil fuels exclusively, when subsidies and tax breaks flow only to oil and gas while renewable investments face uncertainty, that creates winners and losers within the Texas energy sector itself. The companies that have made billion-dollar bets on renewables aren't going to just shrug and accept losses. They're going to fight back. They're going to lobby. They're going to use their political influence to protect their investments. This is capitalism being capitalism. Different fractions of capital competing for favorable policy treatment, for access to subsidies, for regulatory frameworks that benefit their particular business model. Now let's think about the political implications of all this. Texas has been reliably Republican for decades. It's been part of the solid base that a certain political strategy depends on. But that reliability rests on keeping various constituencies happy, or at least not actively threatening their interests. When you're in power, you have to actually govern. You have to make decisions that affect real people and real businesses and real economic flows. You can't just campaign on rhetoric forever. Eventually, policies have consequences, and those consequences create reactions. What's happening now is that those consequences are being felt. Small business owners who thought they were voting for pro-business policies are discovering that some of those policies actually hurt their specific businesses. Suburban voters who have comfortable lives and stable incomes are finding that aggressive cultural warfare and chaotic governance create the kind of instability they move to the suburbs to avoid. Even religious conservatives who might share certain cultural values often have economic interests that conflict with certain policy directions. They own businesses, they employ people, they live in communities that depend on functioning services and infrastructure and stable social conditions. The Republican coalition in Texas, like the Republican coalition nationally, is not monolithic. It's a collection of different groups with different interests held together by opposition to a common enemy and by certain shared cultural signifiers. But when you're actually in power and actually implementing policy, those internal contradictions start to show. The interests of a small business owner in El Paso are not the same as the interests of an oil executive in Houston, are not the same as the interests of a tech entrepreneur in Austin, are not the same as the interests of a rancher in the Panhandle. For a while, those differences can be papered over with rhetoric about freedom and taxes and traditional values. But when concrete policies start affecting people's livelihoods, when they start disrupting the economic arrangements that people depend on, that coalition starts to strain. And here's something else we need to consider. Texas is changing demographically. This isn't some liberal fantasy or wishful thinking, it's statistical fact. The state is becoming more diverse. Younger populations are more diverse. Urban areas are growing while rural areas are declining or stagnating. Now, demographic change doesn't automatically translate into political change. That's a simplistic assumption that often doesn't hold up. People's political identities are complex and don't always align with their demographic category. But demographic change does alter the electorate, does shift the terrain on which political battles are fought, does create new constituencies with different concerns and different leverage. The business community in Texas understands this. They look at demographic trends, they study market research, they think about future labor forces and consumer bases. They know that building a purely antagonistic relationship with immigrant communities, treating them solely as threats to be expelled rather than as part of the economic ecosystem, is short-sighted. They know that cities like Houston and Dallas and San Antonio are becoming majority-minority cities, that the future of Texas is going to be more diverse than its past, and that business models need to adapt to that reality rather than trying to reverse it through force. This is where the contradiction becomes really acute. You have a political strategy based on mobilizing grievance and fear, on treating demographic change as an invasion, on promising to restore some imagined past. But you also have a capitalist economy that depends on growth, that depends on labor, that depends on markets, that depends on the very people this political rhetoric demonizes. Those two things can't coexist indefinitely without creating serious tensions. And that's what we're seeing bubble up now in Texas. Let me also talk about infrastructure and governance because this matters. Texas has had its own infrastructure crises. Remember the winter storm in 2021 that left millions without power, that exposed the fragility of the Texas electrical grid, that killed hundreds of people? That was a governance failure, a failure of the deregulated, privatized approach to essential services that Texas has championed. When you prioritize low taxes and minimal regulation, and private profit over building resilient public infrastructure, you create vulnerabilities. And when those vulnerabilities become crises, people notice. They remember being cold in the dark. They remember pipes bursting. They remember feeling abandoned by the very system that was supposed to serve them. Good governance isn't sexy. It's not exciting. It doesn't generate passionate rallies or viral moments on social media. But people notice when it's absent. They notice when roads are crumbling, when schools are underfunded, when public services are inadequate, when emergencies expose systemic failures. And increasingly, particularly among suburban voters who have enough comfort to care about quality of life rather than just survival, governance competence matters. Chaos, instability, constant crisis, these things wear people down. Even people who might agree with certain policy directions start asking whether the constant drama is worth it, whether there might be a better way to achieve their goals without the perpetual sense of emergency. The backlash in Texas, to the extent it's real and significant, represents all these currents converging. It represents business interests feeling threatened, demographic change creating new political possibilities, infrastructure failures undermining confidence, policy consequences becoming visible, internal coalition tensions surfacing. None of this is about one person panicking. That's the shallow reading, the personality-driven narrative that treats politics as reality television. What's actually happening is structural. It's about contradictions within capitalism itself, about different fractions of the ruling class pursuing different strategies, about the limits of governing through perpetual conflict and chaos, about what happens when rhetoric meets reality and reality pushes back. Now, does this mean Texas is going to flip politically in some dramatic way? I'm not predicting that. Political change is slow. Institutional inertia is powerful. The Republican Party has structural advantages in Texas through gerrymandering and voter suppression and control of state institutions. But what it does mean is that the ground is shifting, that assumptions that held for decades are being tested, that what seemed like a stable base is showing cracks. And those cracks matter because they reveal underlying tensions that aren't going away, that are actually likely to intensify as the contradictions I've described become more acute. The future of Texas politics will be determined by how these economic and demographic forces play out, by whether business interests can successfully push policy in directions that serve their needs, by whether suburban voters continue to prioritize stability over cultural warfare, by whether the Democratic opposition can effectively organize around these opportunities, by whether new political formations emerge that better reflect the actual interests of working people rather than just serving as vehicles for competing elite factions. These are open questions, and the answers will shape not just Texas but national politics, because Texas is too big, too economically important, too symbolically central to the American political narrative to be ignored. What we're witnessing right now is a moment of flux, of possibility, of competing forces testing each other's strength. The backlash, the resistance, the internal conflicts, these aren't signs of panic, they're signs of politics actually happening, of real interests asserting themselves, of the gap between rhetoric and reality becoming visible. And that's worth paying attention to, worth analyzing carefully, worth understanding in its full complexity, rather than reducing it to personalities and headlines. Because if we understand the structural forces at work, we can better navigate this moment, and maybe, just maybe, build something better than what we have now.